Morning, everybody. Welcome to our adult Bible study. This is June 30th. So good to be back with you today. We're going to be talking about wisdom. Boy, could we use some wisdom these days, huh? With all the things going on in our world, and a lot of times there's so many voices that we're hearing, and we could just use a little wisdom. So that's where we are. Talking about wisdom today. I don't know if it's just me. Maybe you're like me, a little bit like this guy right here, wanting to just close your ears because there's so much talk, so many voices. You can hear from CNN or Fox News on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And of course, it's an election year, a big election year. So we hear all the political commercials going already, and it's not even July. Still have several months before the election in November, and we're hearing it all. Of course, then there are all the voices about protesting and Black Lives Matter and police brutality and all those voices. And it seems like, if you stand up and express your protest, your opinion, then you're going to get beat up for that opinion. And if you stay quiet because you're afraid of what you might say might offend somebody, you stay quiet, and then you're going to get beat up for not saying anything and accused that you're racist because you're remaining quiet. And then there's the question of whether I wear a mask when I go into the store or a restaurant, or if I don't, and I'll get funny looks if I'm not wearing a mask. And I'll get funny looks from people if I am wearing a mask. And maybe you just feel this, so many people talking and the voices swirling around. And you get it from social media, you get it from websites, you get it from phone calls from family and friends, you get it from the news broadcast, you get it from any number of places, right? Just lots of voices everywhere talking about all the different issues going on, and it's hard to understand, what should I believe about this? How should I act? How should I respond? What should I do? And if you're anything like me, maybe it's just really easy. You just start to put your hands over your ears in a just sort of metaphorical sense, that you start to tune out. At least tune out some of those voices, and you start to pick those voices that you agree with, the ones you like, the ones that are saying what you think needs to be said. And, well, there can sometimes be a problem with that too, because in this world, even if you think that, the Republican Party or Fox News or if CNN or the Democrat Party, whichever side politically you are on, and well, they're going to share my opinion and they're going to express it the way that I think, and they're on the side of our Christian faith and Christian values and things like that. Well, neither one of those parties and neither one of those organizations is perfectly aligned with our Christian values and beliefs. And so it's really challenging. And if we start to tune out voices, well, that might in some cases be good. But we also have to be really, really careful. And Paul actually gives a warning about this in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He says, "The time will come when men will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth." I think that's a good warning for us not to shut out the most important voice. And we might listen to radio broadcasts, we might listen to TV broadcasts, we might go to social media, we might listen to our family and friends and their opinions. And it is good to listen. But we also need, especially, I wrote about this, for those of you who are members of Faith Lutheran and you get our newsletter and you actually read our newsletter. I wrote about this back in our June newsletter, so that would come out at the beginning of this month. I wrote about how important it is to listen up, to listen to the voice of God, to actually open up the scriptures and listen. So very much opposed to those who would just surround themselves with those who are saying what their itching ears want to hear are those, the writer of Hebrews talks about those who are mature, who by constant use, and what he's talking about is the constant use of the scriptures, actually reading and learning and growing in what God says, and by that constant use, those who are mature have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil, to distinguish. The word there actually might better be translated as discern. And discernment has the idea of cutting right in between what is kind of in a gray area, what is unclear, and being able to discern and distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, what is of God and what is not of God. And so we're going to spend some time really talking about that discernment in some time today and next week, as I'm with you again next week in the adult Bible study. Discerning. How do we discern? My son works as a manager at McDonald's here in Appleton. And recently, he actually came home and he was telling us about how he was counting out cash in the register, which is part of his job as a manager. And as he's counting, a couple of the bills that came through just didn't feel right. And it turns out that someone had brought in counterfeit money, had actually passed counterfeit bills to pay for, and whether that was intentional or not, we have no idea, but how did he know that was counterfeit? Well, it wasn't that he has ever, as I understand, this is the way that bank tellers are trained too. They're not given fake bills. It's just that they know so well what is real, the true bills, and they use those so often, they have their hands on them so often that they're able to distinguish a fake bill because they know the real ones so well. So Evan, when he was counting out cash, was able to feel, because he had counted so many real bills. Well, it's like this in helping to distinguish what do we do and how do we use the scriptures. Well, you get to know what's really real. You get to know what God calls us to be and to do, so that we're able to distinguish what is of God and what is not of God. That's why the writer of Hebrews says, by constant use. So if you're reading what God says, and even though this is the latest, the newest of all of the books of the Bible, was written before 100 AD. So we're talking almost 2,000 years since the latest, the newest of all the books of the Bible was written. It's nearly 2,000 years, and some of them were written 1,500 years before that. And yet, this is a description, when we get into the Bible, it's a description of what God is like and what God expects of us. And even though the Bible doesn't tell us about the internet and about automobiles and other things that are very modern technologies, the Bible still has a lot to say about what we do and how we live and how we treat other people and how we respond to conflict and how we respond to adversity and things like that. The kinds of things that we're still wrestling with, they were wrestling with 3,500 years ago and still wrestling with today. And that is how we sort through what is good and what is not good, what is of God, what is not of God. And how we do that is to know what is really real. And God reveals to us what is really real, and why by constant use we can start to distinguish what is right and what is wrong and do the right things. Listen to the right voices. Listen to counsel. And so to get into this, we're going to have a little Bible study over the next couple weeks, and we'll probably extend it beyond this to the next times that I'm with you in the adult Bible class. And that is to dig into a little study I'm just calling Solomon Says. Solomon Says is all about the book of Proverbs. Now, right about a year ago, maybe 11 months ago here at Faith, we did a study getting ready for the school year theme that we're in right now. We're continuing this on even past the school year we just finished. We're calling the series, the whole theme, Fit. It's faith and training. Boy, is our faith being trained right now, right? I mean, to actually see beyond the immediate and to be able to believe and trust in what we can't see, that God is truly with us. And our faith is truly being trained up. So our whole theme is called Fit, faith and training. And as part of that, to get ready for that series of Fit, we talked about how it might be a good idea to dig into the book of Proverbs. Because, think about this next month, which starts tomorrow with July 1st. There are 31 days in July. And it just so happens that the book of Proverbs has 31 chapters. So if you're not doing any other reading in your Bible, how about tomorrow, July 1st, start with reading one chapter of Proverbs. We're going to go through at least part of the first chapter of Proverbs today. If we don't get through the whole thing, at least part of it. And so tomorrow would be a review. You read Proverbs 1. And then the next day, you read Proverbs 2. And then the next day, Proverbs 3, and then Proverbs 4 and 5, and then so on, all the way a chapter a day for a whole month. That's just one simple way that you can get into the Word of God. Again, if you aren't reading anything else in the Bible, it's a great way. And then, August has 31 days also, so you could do it again. And other months that only have 30 days, you can actually read 2 chapters the last day of the month, if you want. Okay, so every month you go through the book of Proverbs, and it'll be amazing as you find out that even though Proverbs was written almost 1,000 years before Christ, 940 years before Christ, it still has relevance for today. It's amazing. We're going to dig into this a little bit today. I mean, why this book of Proverbs has some relevance for today and what it says to those who are on one side of wisdom and those who are on the side of foolishness. Because really, as we get into the study on Simon Says, it's really not just going to be about what Solomon says. Okay, it's not just the wisdom of a man, because after all, Solomon was not perfect. It's not just what Solomon says. It's really about God's wisdom, godly, heavenly wisdom. The book of James, if we can go there just for a brief moment. The book of James actually talks about 2 different kinds of wisdom. There is the wisdom that is earthly and the wisdom that is heavenly. So James, in writing his letter to Christians of his day, says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." And just highlight that word for a second, humility. Humility comes from wisdom. This is actually something that is spoken of in the book of Proverbs more than once, that those who are wise tend to be those who are not speaking first. They're not quick to jump in to speak. They listen and they observe, and they speak only when it's necessary. So, the old saying, better to be presumed a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt, that kind of thing. There's a great amount of wisdom in being humble enough to remain quiet and listen. And we see that through Proverbs, to seek counsel. And even those who have a lot of life experience can learn from wisdom. We're going to look at that. Continue on. But if you harbor bitter envy, selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. But the wisdom that comes down from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. So what James is actually setting up here is two different sides, almost like a dividing. Remember, Hebrews talks about discerning what's good and what's not good, what's of God and what's not of God. So there's the earthly wisdom or worldly wisdom, and we could put that in quotes, right? It's not truly wisdom, but it seems to be wise. And then there's godly wisdom. So worldly wisdom is described in the book of Proverbs as foolishness, as opposed to godly wisdom that is understanding. There's a contrast set up in Proverbs this way. There's, in the worldly wisdom, there's folly, and from God, prudence. There is anxiety, and that's not the anxiety where you're so much fearful of what would come, but an anxiety of, I'm so anxious to get to something, like you're rushing in to do, to conquer. And on the other side of that is patience. Actually, one proverb that sticks out in my mind: better a patient man than one who takes a city. Right? Sometimes we want to accomplish, we want to tackle, we want to conquer. And Proverbs says, no, better a patient man than one who is anxious and rushes in. On the side of worldly wisdom is laziness, sloth. But from God, diligence. Worldly wisdom is perverse, where godly wisdom is pure. Worldly wisdom raises up anger, where godly wisdom encourages gentleness. Worldly wisdom is for the simple. Godly wisdom is for those who are learned, those who study, those who hear and listen, who explore, right? See the contrast here. We're going to see some of this as we get even just into the first chapter of Proverbs today, and explore what God says through that book, right? So just a real quick outline of what we're going to see in Proverbs. We are not going to, in this study, we're not going to do the entire book of Proverbs. We could spend time on individual ones, but again, I'm encouraging you just to read one of those chapters each day. What I'd like to do is focus on particularly two of those sections of the introduction to Proverbs, and how the first 9 chapters really, Solomon, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, describes how wisdom, godly wisdom, is superior to everything else, and certainly superior to foolishness or folly. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. one of those very familiar words, if you know any of the Old Testament, is this, from Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. That's, in way of introduction, that's an example of what we'll see as we dig into Proverbs. Now, in the second section, really, we're going to divide this up. We're going to start to see this today. We may not get through the entire first section here of chapter 1, but just to give you a sneak peek at some of what we'll explore in Proverbs, Solomon talks about wisdom, and he says, don't reject wisdom, embrace wisdom, listen and remember. So from Proverbs 1:8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. Wisdom is a very good thing, more valuable than jewelry. Okay? Then we're going to explore in chapters 2 through 4 the benefits of wisdom. Just to give you a preview of that, from Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Some familiar words from Proverbs. Again, if you know, maybe have memorized some verses of the Bible, this may be one of those verses. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. That's one of the benefits, is that God will guide us on straight paths in those moments when we lean on him. The third section that we're going to look at in the superiority of wisdom is in the warning against foolishness. And that should not say follow, it should say folly. Warning against folly, okay? And in chapters 5 through 7. Just to give you a couple of previews of that. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension. God despises. He hates these things. Can you see how some of these things are actually what we see in our world today? Oh my goodness, it's a list. It's like Solomon was peeking into 2020, and he's looking at people's lives today, and he's saying, God despises these things. Haughty eyes, that is, eyes that see themselves as more than others, right? Haughtiness, pride, arrogance. A lying tongue. I don't know about you, but it seems like I don't know who to trust these days, because it always seems somebody's lying to you, or they're exaggerating, or they're just hyping it, or whatever. And it's a lying tongue. Truthfulness is so precious because it's hard to find. Hands that shed innocent blood. Well, boy, do we see that going on. A heart that devises wicked schemes. Feet that are quick to rush into evil. Just, again, a list of, it seems like, even though this was written nearly 3,000 years ago, it is so relevant for today. This is the warning against folly. Again, Solomon says in chapter 7 of Proverbs, with persuasive words she led him astray. And she here is a personification of foolishness. So there's Proverbs chapter, especially chapter 8 and 9, gets into personifying wisdom. Wisdom is this voice that calls out. But folly, foolishness, is also a voice that cries out in the world. And this foolishness, with her persuasive words, has led people astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. All at once he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. This is what foolishness does. It looks all good and it's attractive on the outside. You get into it, but it's like slaughter, a noose, an arrow to the liver, a bird going right into a snare. You don't know it's going to cost you your life by going into that trap. And this is the warning that Solomon shares in Proverbs about foolishness. It's deadly. So that's going to be that section. Now then, my son, listen to me. Pay attention to what I say. Do not let your heart turn to her ways, that's folly's ways, or stray into her paths. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Yikes. And then the last section here in the part of superiority of wisdom is that we're going to look at the call of wisdom. Again, wisdom personified like it's a person, like a person calling out, a woman with a beautiful voice, calling to be heard. Even in chapter 1, we're going to hear this call from wisdom. But just to give you a preview of chapter 8, I, wisdom, dwell together with prudence. I possess knowledge and discretion. By me, kings reign and rulers make laws that are just. By me, princes govern and all nobles who rule on earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me find me. With me are riches and honor, enduring wealth and prosperity. My fruit is better than fine gold. What I yield surpasses choice silver. Wisdom keeps saying, if you listen to me, the treasure is so much more than what you could find in all the riches of the world. If you had all the gold in the world, it wouldn't measure up to having wisdom. It's that precious and valuable. I walk in the way of righteousness along the paths of justice, bestowing wealth on those who love me and making their treasuries full. Now, this is not, some would call it prosperity gospel. The gospel that says, oh, well, if you just trust in the Lord, then you'll have all the riches of the world. No. The treasuries full is not talking about money treasuries. This is talking about a life that is blessed and full in ways that you can't measure by money and possessions. You can't measure it with your eyes or with value the world places on it. It's heavenly treasures. It's eternal treasures. It's joy and happiness and peace, deep down peace that can't be stolen away from any trouble in this world or any enemy that would face us. When we hear the call of wisdom and we live the life of wisdom, then Proverbs says, wisdom makes our treasuries full. So again, just a preview of what we're going to see. Now, I will say, and I'm going to be monitoring my computer screen here. If there's a point during the study when you have a question you'd like to raise, then feel free to put that in the chat, either whether you're on Facebook or on our website watching live. You can type that into the chat, and I'll, from time to time, just monitor and see if there are any questions as we dig in. All right? So let's go to Solomon Says, this study, and dig into Proverbs chapter 1. If you have a Bible, you can certainly pull that out, and we will. I'm using the New International Version, the NIV, so you can follow along there. I'll put the words up on the screen, so you can certainly just follow along by watching your screen. I'll put the words up there. We're going to dig in the first 7 verses here, just begin. If you remember, this is the intro, the introduction part of Proverbs, the first 7 chapters. This is from Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. The Proverbs of Solomon, we're told. For attaining wisdom, went too far. For attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail, just reading really quickly those first 7 verses. But notice that there are, in verses 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, there are 5 times this word for, F-O-R, for appears in verses 2, 3, 4, and 6. We'll see this in just a second in the next slide in verse 6. But this is describing what the Proverbs, what this book of Proverbs is given us for. It's the purpose of this book, for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight. Insight from those who have lived life and they've experienced the challenges and they've experienced the temptations. They've experienced the hardships and the joys and everything else. And from that have gained insight and now give those words for us to listen to. And we can gain understanding from other people's experiences. So, I know sometimes the best way to get insight and get understanding is actually to experience it ourselves and sometimes learn the hard way. But there's sometimes we could learn by just listening and not have to learn it the hard way. And that's one of the purposes to actually get understanding from the words of insight of those who have gone through some sometimes tragic, sometimes deeply troubling experiences, or have gone the way of foolishness and have turned back from foolishness because they've seen it as a destructive road. So those are all opportunities and why Proverbs is presented to us. It's for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life. You notice a lot of synonyms: wisdom, discipline, and prudence are very close synonyms of each other. Doing what was right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Then there's this little bit of a parenthetical thought here, giving prudence to the simple. And he says, let the wise listen. So even those who are wise, in fact, one of the things that marks people as wise, that you'll see throughout Proverbs, one of the things that marks them is listening. As I say, we've been given one mouth and two ears for a reason, that we would listen at least twice as much as we speak. And I think that's a good thing to remember. Wise people do much more listening. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. And let the discerning get guidance. Again, here's that fifth for statement: for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. And then, again, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord is this, like revering. Some say it's not so much terror, although it is in a sense that you have a fear that God could do anything He wants, and you fear the Lord. And this is the beginning of understanding that you can say, well, what God says, okay, that was for a different day. It's irrelevant for us today. No. Trusting that God knows better because He sees everything, He is over all. This is part of wisdom. It's the beginning of wisdom, is putting yourself in a place where God is much greater than you are, and you put yourself in a submissive posture. Remember what James says about heavenly wisdom. It's submissive. It's putting yourself below and submitting yourself to the authority of God. That's the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. But fools, of course, just despise that wisdom and discipline. Now, I want to take just a little sidetrack here, because I want you to notice something that we will see over and over and over and over again in Proverbs, and that is, and by the way, the BTW at the top, if you're not up on texting lingo, where everything is abbreviated, BTW is by the way. By the way, little sidetrack here about parallelism in Hebrew poetry. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and especially in Psalms and in Proverbs, verses are in parallel in poetry. Now, there are other places where poetry occurs. In the historical accounts, people break into poetry. In the prophets, you'll get quite a bit of poetry also, and it appears the same there, but there's a lot of parallelism. And the purpose of parallelism is actually for helping to memorize, especially when you think about before a lot of the scripture was written down, it was shared orally. So one generation would speak the words of the scriptures to be learned by the next generation. And it's much easier to hear it and memorize it if it's in parallel. So here's what I mean by that. I'm going to put a box around just the first half of the verse. This is Proverbs 1:4. Just the first half of that verse is in parallel to the second half of the verse. Happens the same in verse 5. The first half of the verse, the second half of the verse. Basically what you get is A and B. A is the first half of the verse, B is the second half of the verse. Then you get, A is the first half of the first half of the verse. B is the second half of the first half of the verse. Then there's A prime, B prime. So that first box at the top, for giving prudence to the simple, is A and B. Then knowledge and discretion to the young is A prime, B prime. So these two parts of the verse are in parallel. So they're connected, and those two lines are in parallel. And I'll give you just a little further explanation here. So in the first half of each of those lines, you get prudence, which is in parallel with knowledge and discretion. A lot of times in parallel, you'll get synonyms. Prudence is a synonym of knowledge and discretion. And sometimes it builds a little bit more on the expressions. So if you want to say prudence, but then what do we really mean by that? Well, we mean knowledge and discretion. In the second half of that, you get simple and young. Those who are simple are especially the young. Who are the ones right now who are out protesting and throwing bricks through store windows and burning things and tearing down statues and other things that are destructive and, quite frankly, foolish? Who are the ones doing that? The young, the ones who don't have as much life experience as some of the rest of us, who have been around the block a time or two. The simple should actually listen. The young should listen, right? Those two expressions are in parallel. Look at the following verse, verse 5. Again, the wise and the discerning are in parallel. They're saying largely the same thing. And then add to their learning, get guidance, saying the same thing. That's part of Hebrew parallelism. It's using synonyms for emphasis, using synonyms for easy memorization and understanding to help expand on what you mean by the first half of the verse by having a second half that expands on it a little bit more. This is the case in verse 6 where it says for understanding proverbs and parables. Well, what do we mean by proverbs and parables? We mean the sayings and riddles of the wise. It's just an expounding on the second half of that first box. That's just one way that we have things in parallel. We can also have verses in parallel that bring contrast. So these two boxes, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, is actually the opposite of the second half of the verse. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. See how it's actually used as opposite. It's not synonyms, it's antonyms. It's speaking about so sometimes in parallel you'll see synonyms, sometimes just expanding, and sometimes contrast. And those are just some of the things that we'll see as we go through. So that's the side note, right, about Hebrew parallelism. All right. So again, we looked at the introduction, verses 1 through 7, and now want to look at the first part of what Solomon expresses about the superiority of wisdom, why wisdom is so much better than anything else you can find in this world. And to do that, let's first look at what he says in chapter 1. Do not reject wisdom. And for that, we'll dig right into the Bible. So, again, words on the screen, or you can look at them from your own Bible, starting at verse 8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. By the way, notice the parallel there. Father's instruction, mother's teaching, saying the same thing. Listen, do not forsake, saying the same thing. Because your father's instruction and your mother's teaching will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. It's like a victor's crown would be the garland to grace your head, something beautiful, like flowers in your hair, if you will. A chain, I'm imagining like a Cleopatra big pure gold chain around your neck. If you listen to your father's instruction and you don't forsake your mother's teaching, it'll be like this beautiful gold, pure gold chain around your neck. It glistens, it is valuable. This is what you get with it, except it's even greater. Really what Solomon will continue to say is that it's much greater than anything like jewelry that would adorn your neck. All right? Keep going here, verse 10. My son, if sinners entice you, do not give in to them. If they say, come along with us, let's lie in wait for someone's blood, let's waylay some harmless soul, let's swallow them alive like the grave, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We will get all sorts of valuable things and fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot with us, and we will share a common purse. My son, do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths, for they rush into sin. Their feet are swift to shed blood, right? Don't do it. This reminds me so much of Psalm 1. And if you have your Bible, I don't have the words of Psalm 1 on the screen, but if you have your Bible, you could look at this. Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, stand in the way of sinners, sit in the seat of mockers. And Psalm 1 actually goes on to say that person, what it means to be blessed is that he'll be like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in season, whose leaves do not wither. Whatever he does prospers. So Solomon is saying, my son, and we could say this. Some of you have kids of your own, grandkids of your own, and you think about all the times, oh, if they would just listen, if they would just hear and understand. Son, when sinners are trying to entice you into foolishness, rushing in to sin, don't do it. Do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths. How useless to spread a net in full view of all the birds. Now, this is a really interesting expression that I think will get hashed out a little bit in the coming verses. How useless to spread a net in full view of all the birds. Now, it seems like what he's just been talking about is actually a group of people who would be setting a trap for somebody else. What do you mean it's in full view of all the birds? Well, it's actually describing what we're going to see here in just a second, is how someone's foolishness turns back on themselves. You set a trap for someone else, and it's really just bringing yourself to destruction. And it's like, here you're setting out a trap which you would fully see, and yet you're setting it in full view of those who will be trapped by it, which means yourself. So verse 18, these men lie in wait for their own blood. They waylay only themselves. Such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it. Let's emphasize that verse. Such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. Eventually, it comes back against you. I think about how often there have been movements to trap somebody who would be a political opponent, let's say, by let's look at the opposite party and see how they've been corrupted by receiving money illegitimately from others, or have been caught in adulterous situations. We point out what's going on in the other party as far as manipulation and behind the scenes dealing, just to find out that the same thing is happening in our own party. The same greed, the same manipulation, the same adultery, and we end up trapping our own allies by our scheming. And we see this over and over and over again in politics in a worldly sense. In whichever party you're in, you'll see it. You're just, such is the end to those who are going after ill-gotten gain. It might be cheap shots. It might be spreading dirt on someone who would be your opponent. It might be going after illegally, getting money, or robbing someone's home or possessions or something else, or getting it by some dishonest way. It always comes back. Such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it. Just ugliness. Wisdom calls aloud in the street. This is the next section, starting verse 20. Wisdom calls aloud in the street, and she raises her voice in public squares. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. In the gateways of the city, she makes her speech. Notice some of these words here. Wisdom is not hidden. It's not like you have to go and climb a high mountain and find some isolated guru sitting in meditation on the top of a mountain and find wisdom from that person. This is not how you find wisdom. Wisdom is there for everybody to find. Calling aloud in the street. Right? She raises her voice in the public squares. Wisdom is there for you to find her at the head of the noisy streets. Yeah, there's a lot of clamoring, and we talked about this at the very beginning, just all the voices that we're hearing. Wisdom is there too, in the midst of all those voices. In the gateways of the city, she makes her speech. Wisdom can be found. Look for her. Listen for wisdom's voice. Here again, wisdom is being personified, like wisdom is a person shouting out among all the other voices to be heard. So, again, BTW, by the way, another thing about parallelism. And it's interesting in this verse. And is what is called chiasm. So I'm going to highlight, and this is actually not half a verse, second half of the verse. This is actually one verse to the next verse. So verse 20 and 21 are in parallel in what's called chiasm, or chiastic parallelism, or chiasmus is what it's sometimes called. Chiasm, so instead of AB, AB, instead it's AB, BA. So what matches up with B, which is the second half of the first verse, is actually the beginning of the second verse. So in the street, in the public squares, at the head of the noisy streets, in the gateways of the city, those are in parallel, but the first two are at the second half, the second two are in the first half. Does that make sense? So what you get, and why it's called chiasm, is that if you line these up, A, B, B, A, and you match them, they make what looks like the Greek letter chi. Chi. And chi is where we get our letter X. Chi just looks like a letter X. Chi is the Greek letter that is the first word, or first letter in the word Christos, Christ. It's where we get our CH. Chi. So it's chiasm. Get it? By the way, this is going down another rabbit hole from a rabbit hole here for just a second. But a little tidbit for you. If you ever notice, I know when I was in college and seminary, I don't know if it's still prevalent today, a lot of people would make a big fuss about when we get to Christmas. And rather than writing Merry Christmas, you might write Merry Xmas. And people would say, don't X out Christ. It's not Xing out Christ, it's actually just using a shorthand for Christ, because the chi is the first letter of Christ, Christos, and so it became a shorthand of saying Christmas. Yeah, we could say, use the whole word, why shorthand it, but it's just been something that's been done throughout the history of the church, actually. Just a parallel or a sidetrack to our sidetrack here. But that's another thing about parallelism, chiastic, okay, making the letter X. Moving on. Wisdom. Wisdom is calling aloud, okay, raising her voice, crying out, making her speech. What we're going to see over the next several verses is what wisdom says. Okay, if wisdom is a person speaking out in the street, in the public squares, crying out at the head of the noisy streets, here's what wisdom is saying. Okay? So, how long will you simple ones love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? This is what wisdom is saying. Wisdom is crying out, notice, to three different kinds of people: simple ones, mockers, and fools. I'm sorry, but I see a lot of all three of these going on in our world right now. A lot of simple people, a lot of mocking people, a lot of foolish people. And wisdom is saying, how long are you going to continue in your simple, mocking, foolish ways? If you had responded to my rebuke, if you would have listened to my rebuke, wisdom says, I would have poured out my heart to you. I would have made my thoughts known to you. But since you rejected me, when I called and no one gave heed when I stretched out my hand, since you ignored all my advice and would not accept my rebuke, I in turn will laugh at your disaster. I will mock when calamity overtakes you. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you like a whirlwind, when distress and trouble overwhelm you. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes have a real challenge listening to this. You know, it's like wisdom is saying, if you would have listened, I would have spoken to you, I would have given you and shown you my ways, but since you rejected me, I'm just going to laugh at you when disaster strikes. I'm going to mock you when calamity overtakes you. And I think this doesn't sound like God. Right? If this is in the Bible, how is this? It doesn't sound like God. Why would God laugh when disaster hits or mock us? But we have to remember that in Proverbs, while this is inspired by God, these words are actually the words of wisdom. Wisdom is one of God's creations. Wisdom was one of the first of God's creations. Wisdom is something that comes from God, but it really represents how the world was formed. Chapter 8 of Proverbs talks about how wisdom became the foundation for everything that was built that we see. Everything that comes, or that came about in creation, was built on wisdom. Wisdom represents how God set up the world to be. And he set up that there would be consequences for your actions. So if I'm lazy, I should not expect that I will get anything except poverty. If I'm diligent, and if I'm a farmer, for instance, I go about diligently plowing the fields and planting and watering and getting weeds out of the way and things like that, so allow the crop to grow, then the diligence of my work will be rewarded by crops that come out, by having wealth from that. If I'm lazy, I'm just going to know poverty. Another way of thinking about this, there are natural consequences. I think about this with my kids. My son comes to me and says, my brother hit me. No kidding. Why did that? I learned a long time ago that I don't just take his, one kid's word over the others. The first one to come to me just got hit, punched in the arm or smacked in the back or whatever it was. Why did you get hit? Well, I threw mud in his face. No kidding. You know, you do something that is going to just bring a natural reaction from somebody. So if you go and destroy someone's property, then you might have some legal consequences, a fine or jail time or something because you destroyed someone's property. This is just a natural consequence, right? You do something foolish, and foolishness comes back at you. You know, the consequences of foolishness come back at you. And wisdom is there saying, well, if you would have listened to me, you would have known my ways. But you listened to foolishness instead, and I'm just going to sit back and laugh at your disaster when calamity overtakes you and overwhelms you. It sweeps over you like a whirlwind because you lived a foolish life, and now you're reaping the consequences. It's like if I go and I spend, but I don't have any income, just keep spending money, and I rack up debt, I shouldn't be surprised when people come and repossess my car and my boat and my house and anything else that I spent money on because I couldn't pay for it. It's foolishness, right? That might be overwhelming. The debt might be overwhelming, might be swirl in and take over like a whirlwind, but I brought it on myself. And wisdom just says, I'm going to sit back and laugh. This is what happens when you don't listen to wisdom. And then they will call. And I know that we're just past 11 o'clock. We'll finish this up in chapter 1. I know if you have to go, understand, but we're just finish off chapter 1 and then we'll be done with it. Then they will call to me. I find this really fascinating, right? In the previous verses, wisdom is saying, when you rejected me, and since you rejected me, I will laugh at your disaster. Then all of a sudden, the pronoun changes. It's as if wisdom is no longer just addressing the fools, those who went after a destructive lifestyle. Now wisdom is addressing everyone so that you would listen. Look, they'll call to me and I won't answer. They'll look for me, but they won't find me. Since they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, since they would not accept my advice and spurned my rebuke, they will eat the fruit of their ways and be filled with the fruit of their schemes. Notice the fruitfulness. It could be bad fruit or it could be good fruit. If you go the way of foolishness, it'll be bad fruit. If you go the way of wisdom, it'll be good fruit. For the waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me, notice this is the contrast. Whoever listens to me, that's wisdom. Wisdom is saying this. This is the end of her speech, calling out at the streets. Whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. Now, just because you go the way of wisdom, is that going to keep you safe and free of all harm? No. You can do all things right and still have harm come to you, but it's not going to be the harm that comes from you because of your own actions. You're not going to reap the whirlwind when you sowed the wind, to use that expression, right? You're not throwing out foolishness just to get the consequence of foolishness. You might be harmed because of someone else's foolishness, but you can be at peace and at ease because your actions, your words are out of wisdom. Godly wisdom. So wisdom is saying when you listen, you'll live in that safety of your choices and your words when you listen and heed wisdom's call. So we got through chapter 1. of Proverbs as we have been listening up, not just to all the voices of the world, but listening to God's voice of wisdom. And next time we're going to dig in to look at the benefits of wisdom. So if you are able to join me next Tuesday at the same time, again, as always, we'll have those videos available after the fact as well. But you can join us next week for, we'll be into July. Wow. July, we're halfway through 2020 after today. Hopefully the second half is way better than the first half. Right? But anyway, next week we'll be together, God willing. We will join back into looking at Proverbs chapter 2 and the benefits of wisdom. We'll dig into what God says there. Again, if you're not doing any other reading in the Bible and you want to pick up tomorrow, reread chapter 1 of Proverbs, and then the next day, Proverbs 2, and then Proverbs 3, and so on. You'll be ahead of where we'll be next week when we get together again, if that is what you're going to plan on doing and reading through Proverbs. But if you would just join me in prayer as we close off, and we'll close off with that. Okay. Our gracious Lord, I thank you for the wisdom which you bring to us, the wisdom which was shared even 3,000, 2,000 years ago, which we can still learn from in our day. God, would you help us truly to have ears to listen, eyes that pay attention to what is going on in the world, and looking at your word, listening to your word, and helping us to apply what we're hearing from you, and using wisdom with what we say and how we respond, what we do, knowing what is really real so that we can live our lives not by what is counterfeit, not what is earthly and unspiritual and temporary, but what is lasting and godly and wise, disciplined, prudent, full of knowledge, and truly live, Lord, for you. Guard our hearts, guard our minds, guard our mouths and our lips, so that when we speak, it truly will be coming out of godly wisdom. We ask it in the name of Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Well, God bless you. Have a great week in the Lord. And again, God willing, we'll see you next time.